Hi, hello, and welcome to College of Lore. I'm Jill,
And I'm Kate.
and today we're going to talk to you about a tabletop role playing game. Surprise, surprise. This one is Kids on Bikes. Kids on Bikes is a rules light storytelling system where there's a game master running the game, and the players are all playing as like kids or teens or adults who are trying to sort of solve a mystery or figure something out that's happening in the town and sort of resolve like a strange and mysterious
There's
situation.
something weird going on. It might be supernatural or like a conspiracy or something like that.
Right. So you can kind of get an idea of it if you've watched Stranger Things. So this game takes place in a decade of your choice. We chose
Hmm.
the 80s,
Yeah,
and I think we landed on around 83, which
I
I
think so
think is
too.
it's before either of us were born. Is that true?
Yeah, it's 1 year before I was born.
Okay, yeah. It's a few years before I was born.
Yeah. So, one thing about the setting, so you said that we pick a decade to play in.
Mhm.
The book does
Uh,
recommend that you choose um, a decade like pre everyone having a smartphone in their pocket.
Yeah.
So it could be like 90s is sort of pushing the upper limit of where we want to set. So you could go anywhere before 90s, but yeah. So it's meant to be pre modern age technology. Yeah, and another unique feature about this role playing game in general is that while the setting is like real world and most of the players, well, all of the players are just normal, run of the mill, everyday people without any special um, like magic or powers. There is one powered character that comes into the story, and everybody collectively controls that player, so, or that character.
One thing that makes this role playing game special is that the players take on a lot of the narrative burden off the game master. Most RPGs that I've played, the dungeon master or game master has had most of the narrative responsibility in that they're really driving the plot and kind of taking everything the players do and working it into their plot and things like that. Whereas in Kids on Bikes, the players are meant to have a lot more narrative control, and the game master takes on a bit more of a reactive role and works sort of for the players more so,
Which
which is
is,
really different and exciting.
yeah. And coming from a perspective of focusing on storytelling and loving RPGs as a method of collaborative storytelling, this aspect of Kids on Bikes is something that really speaks to, I think, both of us, right?
Mhm. Definitely.
So allowing players more narrative control just increases the ability to create a story collaboratively.
All right, so now we're moving on to character creation. One thing that makes this RPG unique is the world building as well as the character creation, because I
Yeah.
feel like they kind of go a little bit hand in hand. This world building is entirely collaborative, so it takes a lot of the burden off the GM to kind of initially create this world because together, like the whole group works together on the world building.
Yeah.
And that is done through a series of questionnaires, which is was probably one of my favorite parts of playing. Actually,
Yeah.
was this questionnaire situation.
Yeah. So for the world building part of it, there's 8 questions that they have in the book that the group needs to answer about the world or the town that they're living in. And then
Mhm.
each player also gets to come up with a rumor that they heard
The
about the
rumors,
town.
the rumors were so fun.
I love the rumors as well. And that rumor stuff is what
Mhm.
I built the plot from,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So it's interesting because not all the rumors are necessarily true, and they weren't all true, but I got to pick and choose from those rumors that were there. Like, okay, I'm gonna get these three. They're the things that are actually happening, and how do they work together, and how are they related?
Mhm.
And that was really, really fun for me. And I don't know how you feel when you're going about world building or creating a new world for a campaign. But part of the reason that I like to use pre-generated content is because I find it overwhelming to come up with all of that stuff myself. And so it was great because I still got to play off of all of that stuff and riff off of everything that you guys came up with and create something myself, but I had stuff to go on to start
Mhm.
myself. So it was, I love that aspect of this game.
Yeah, and even recently, we took a lot of these techniques to create a Dungeons and Dragons themed world. So, yeah, we loved it so much that we're embracing it and using it moving forward.
Yeah, there's aspects of this role playing game that we now kind of want to apply to of any other game system that we're going to be using.
So, immediately after world building, if you're doing it all in one session, you start into the character creation questions.
So the first
Okay.
thing that you do when you're creating your character is you sort of need to pick their, I'll call
Trope,
it trope because there's a bunch of tropes
call it
listed at the back of the book. And so you don't need to pick one of these tropes. You can create your own character like completely from scratch, but the tropes are really, really useful because they give you sort of like a good variety of like different kinds of characters that you might be able to create. And then there's certain things, if you pick that trope, there's certain things that are already decided for you. So you select a trope. You can then select your age based on the ages that are applicable to your trope, because not every trope could have any age. And you pick your strengths and your flaws and your first name. So yeah, you choose your trope depending, like if you want to show up to the character creation session already having kind of chosen your trope or narrowed it down or whatever, that's great. But the thing that you do need to all be together for is the next part, which is answering questions about your relationship with other people. So another thing, when we were creating our tropes and deciding on the tropes, I think that you guys already sort of started to figure out like who knew who and how you were related to each other. And that is important to determine before you answer the questions. But basically, before we get into that, there's 3 different ways you can go about answering these questions. There's quick start questions, which is supposed to take about 2 minutes per player. There's one-sided questions, which is 5 minutes per player. And then there's complete questions, which is 8 minutes per player. I believe, did we do one-sided
No,
or all the way?
we did the whole kit and
Yeah.
caboodle. We wanted the full
Yeah.
experience.
So this is like a push and pull between the depth of relationships that you develop as a result of answering these questions and how fast you want it to be. So yeah, that's
It was
one of the
so
most unique features of this system.
Mhm.
I have played other RPGs that have collaboration incorporated into character creation, like Fate is one that comes to mind. But this is fairly unique, in my opinion, because the way that other players are answering questions will impact your character. It
Mhm.
changes your character. All right, so the last thing that falls into this character creation topic is the powered character. Um, I think typically the GM, like the way that it's presented in the book, the GM will come up with, will create the powered character and sort of introduce them to the party. But we actually did collaboratively develop the powered character as well. We didn't do this on stream because we didn't really have time, but we all got together on a little video call and created the power character together. So what did you think of that process, Jill?
I thought that was really fun. So we all had our say in what kind of powers this character had and what kind of like traits she had and
They're
everything
called,
like that.
yeah, they're called aspects. So these
Okay.
are like basically her powers.
And but also wasn't like a lot of the aspects weren't even about powers. It was like one of the aspects of her was like she really liked animals and she would never refuse a snack and
Yes.
we so what was interesting about creating her was just yeah, just each of us having a say and then we would control that aspect of her while she was in play. So
Yeah.
one person, yeah, like she would never refuse a snack and she loved granola bars. So that character was using granola bars to kind of befriend her and gain trust and friendship. had a lot of different personality traits. Like there's like a chart of different personality traits they could have, the relationship to the group, psychic powers they could have. And some of those were really interesting, like able to change their body's density, or able to harm others by touching them. Like there's just this wide variety, and you don't even have to use one of the ones from the chart, but it gives you a very broad like a bunch of examples to draw from. So yeah, I felt like that mechanic, like everyone getting to control this powered character, that was unlike anything I'd ever seen in another RPG so far.
Yeah.
Like one NPC, but it's actually like a multi PC. I don't know, just having one
Hmm.
character that everyone has a bit of control over was so unique to me.
Well, and when I started like reading through this book, my first question was like, well, who gets to be the powered character?
Right.
Because that's obviously what everybody is going to want, is to be a powered
Mhm.
character, right?
Mhm.
So it works around that really well because everybody gets to play the powered character. So it's not like
Yeah.
one person is just going to be this superstar who can shape rocks and freeze time and whatever they want, and then everyone else
Yes.
is like, I have a pocket knife, like
I shine my flashlight in
yeah,
their eyes.
yeah. Does
Yeah,
it hurt them?
totally.
No? Okay, well, I'll just
Oh, no.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'll just stay over here and let you take care of it. Yeah, so I
Yeah.
really, really like that solution.
Now we're gonna talk a little bit about the mechanics of Kids on Bikes. So one of the interesting mechanics was the different dice and how each die is assigned to a different skill. And I really enjoyed that because it really put into perspective my strengths and weaknesses in my character. It was
Mhm.
really really diverse. Like, you have a D12 on something, but you only have a D4 on something else. So it was
Yep.
you had this very good array.
Yeah.
Like you can't have some character that comes in and they're all like 12, 12, 12, 12, 12. It's like,
Yeah.
no, everyone is evenly spread.
Yep. And so there's 6 different stats, and you assign one of the 6 different dice to each of those stats. So your strongest stat is your D20 stat, your weakest stat is your D4 stat, and everything in between.
It was really, I loved that. I
Yeah.
thought that was so cool.
And so the way
uh,
that these stats come into play is whenever you're trying to do something, the DM will come up with a difficulty rating, which is what you need to roll equal to or above to succeed. And then the player gets to choose how they're going to approach that situation and what stat they're going to use to overcome the challenge. So this is interesting, and this is part of where the narrative comes in, right? In D&D, I would be like, you need to roll a perception check, or you need to roll a strength check, or whatever it is. But here, Jill gets to be like, well, I'm going to spray this thing
can of
with a
hairspray.
can of hairspray and a lighter, and I'm going to use my
Intelligence
intelligence to
instead
do
of,
that.
yeah.
And as long as Jill like explains that in a way that I think makes sense,
Mhm.
I can let her use whatever stat she wants.
I really love the discussions that came out of this,
Yeah.
like trying to, if it felt very much like you're trying to sell the DM something, like, or the GM something, sorry.
Yeah.
Like, hey, if I could use this because what was one of them? It was like there was a strength sort of related one where we're trying to climb out of the cave,
Or like down into the cave.
or
And
down into
then
the cave,
what
and then
happened is, yeah.
my character got down okay. So then she was trying to help another character to succeed and allow them to use their intelligence stat because they learned how to get down
And
the
observed you,
rope.
and so
Yeah.
used their like memory of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So instead of it
So
being strength for them, they got to use a die that was higher in an intelligence sort of situation.
so this is going to depend on your
GM.
GM, like
Yeah.
how much they're going to take, but I I like creativity. And so if you
Me
can come
too.
up with something that, even if it doesn't sound super plausible, as long as I find it entertaining, you're going to get away with
Yeah.
it.
Like, is it fun?
Yeah.
That's the point of the game.
Yeah.
So you're doing a good job there.
However, here's a
Mhm.
thing that maybe is a bit of a criticism of the system. Because you can do that, like what is even the point of having low stats? Because if you're good enough, you can just argue to use your D20 stat on every single check that you make in the game. And so I think that it is
Good
important.
balance.
It is important to, as the GM, say like, no, that doesn't make
Yeah,
sense.
totally.
You're not good at this, so you're gonna, you're gonna have to risk it.
And I
But
think you said no a couple of times because
maybe
it didn't fit.
we'll have to watch it
Yeah,
watch it back.
we'll have to watch and find out.
But here's the interesting thing about when you are trying to do something and you fail, right?
This was so I love this mechanic.
Yeah, so failing is, I mean, you don't do the thing, so it is bad in that respect, just like,
Yeah, I know it's so
uh,
good.
so when you fail a stat check, you get something called an adversity token. And adversity tokens are something that you can then use later on in the game on different stat checks. Sometimes it's going to be something you apply to your own stat check, but as long as you're doing what's called a planned action, like you have some time and it's not really time crunched, you can actually use your adversity tokens to help other people boost their die rolls as well. So every adversity token that you spend on a skill check gives +1 to the die roll that the player made. So a good idea in this game is to try and do stuff when it's not super important that you don't think you're going to succeed at. It's to try and fail maybe, or like at least not be afraid to do stuff that you're not going to succeed at, because it will give you those adversity tokens which you can accumulate for some really important check later on, and then spend them to make sure that you succeed, even if you're trying to do something that maybe you're not super good at naturally. So the
I
adversity tokens are so cool.
I love that. I think it's a big deal because in a lot of games, failure can be so like you're left a little bit empty after you've made a failure.
Yeah, there's nothing
In this,
good. Yeah.
yeah, but in this game, it's like, okay, you did fail, but now you have another token that's going to help you down the road or
Yeah.
help someone else down the road.
Yeah. And another thing that they mention in the book is like for the GM, a failed roll should never be like just negative. Like it should always
Mm.
kind of push the narrative forward in some way. So even though you
Mhm.
didn't do the thing you were trying to do, something develops and happens as a result.
Mhm.
So that's really cool. I
That
like
would
that.
really help with those dead end situations
Yep.
that when you're running a game you might run into.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's like, what do you do
and
now?
something you can yeah, and something you can definitely pull forward into other games too, I think.
Yep,
It's
for
like
sure.
if they fail, it's like what's the saying? It's like there's yes and then there's no but.
Right, right.
So you're saying like no, you can't do that, but this
But
happens.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So I love that.
Mhm.
Another mechanic that sort of incentivizes trying things that you might fail at is the exploding dice thing.
Oh, I love that too. I don't
So
know if we saw much or any of that
no,
in the
because
game,
it's not likely to
but
happen.
it's
So
rare.
what happens is when you're making a stat check, if you roll the highest number on the die that you're using and you haven't succeeded with that roll, you get to roll the die again.
It's always worth trying something. Like,
Yeah,
even if you only have a D4 in that stat, you might get lucky and you might as well give it a shot, even if the difficulty is like seemingly out of reach. It's still always
I
possible.
think that that is fun. It makes it frees the characters from like worrying
Hmm.
about and like maybe not taking a chance because they're afraid of failure, because failure
Hmm.
isn't a bad thing in this game. It creates an interesting story and it moves things forward and you get a benefit, and maybe you'll like randomly succeed at this thing that you just should not in any way like succeed at. So I just
And
think it's
that
great.
is so exciting when
Yeah.
that happens. And I
Yeah,
think, like, yeah, I think the big failures and the big successes are one of the things that make role playing games so exciting.
for sure. For sure.
So I've come up with a couple of questions I wanted to ask you
Sure.
because you ran it, I didn't run it, and I'm curious.
Okay.
So I was wondering, like, what made GMing this game difficult, or was it kind of easier than some others you've run? Like, what was the difficulty level here?
How does it measure up?
Yeah.
So, my answer is it was both easier and more difficult in different ways.
Okay.
So, I'll explain the two things, right? So, the things that make it easier, I think we already kind of touched on. So the collaborative world building session and the collaborative character building session, that really makes creating the session or the scenario super easy. It sparked a lot of creativity in me, and I really, really enjoyed that. So we've already basically talked about that. So in that way, it's easier. Also, it's very rules light and it's very fluid. So you don't need to remember a whole lot in order to know the rules and be able to like enforce them while you're GMing. So that's easy as well. It's not as clunky as some other systems. You're not really like looking things up very often to see how they work. And if you are, it's super easy to find because the book is just, it's a very small, tiny little rule book.
Yeah, add a couple tabs and you're good to go.
You're good to go, yep. And like the back of the book has tables for everything that you might need to reference. So really, yeah, it's great for that. However, I did find this challenging. We played, 3 little sessions, 2 actual play sessions. The first session was just world building and character creation. And I think I got more comfortable DMing the game as we went, but I still don't know that I'm as comfortable with it as I am with some other systems. I doubt whether I'm approaching it the best way. So the thing that is weird about this game is the fact that the players can take narrative control and should take narrative control in certain situations. And I was finding it hard to balance that. So I found it hard to know when I should be handing narrative control over to the players and when I should be controlling the narrative. So in the first session that we played, there were times where I like handed narrative control over to you guys, and then you did something that kind of pulled you in a weird direction that I had this overarching story that I was trying to have happen, and the choices that you made were like, okay, and like I just had to go with it and like wing it and like try and figure out how to get things back on track. And I do think that I ended up succeeding in that, but it wasn't easy for me. Like I found it weird. And so I think the way that I dealt with that was in the second session, changing the times when I allowed the players to have narrative control so that the decisions that they got to make didn't have the ability to like completely derail and have them go in a completely different area. So like, for example, in that second stream, when you guys went to the abandoned building on the waterfront, there was nothing there, right, in my mind. And so I made it work, and there was that little tunnel underneath, and you guys got to see the garden club lady, and you got to see all of the radioactivity down there. So it ended up working out, I think. But that whole time in my brain, if I seemed composed, I was like, what am I gonna do? Like, I don't know. So, okay, so here's my takeaway for this game. If you are very flexible and you don't mind improvising and you don't have like an overarching story plot that you're trying to have happen, then it's going to be really easy because the players are going to decide something and you're like, okay, well then let's go this way. And I do like that kind of DMing, but we were streaming this and I wanted it to take a limited amount of time. It took longer than I had planned. We had, like I said, 3 streams instead of just two. I was thinking 1 or 2.
Yeah.
But yeah, because I wanted to have this story happen, the allowing players to take narrative control kind of tugged with this story plan that I had. However, I think if you were fine just like meandering about, then you just don't have that plan and you just let it happen. So if you're a DM that you think that would be fine for you, then this will be really, really fun and collaborative. Otherwise, you're going to want to really think about like when to let characters have narrative control. So like describing the effects of their attack on somebody versus like deciding where to go next in the
Mhm.
town, right? Like if you have
Yeah.
something planned at every single building in the town, cool, then let them choose where they want to go. Or if you feel like you can just come up with it, cool, let them go. But if not, it's like you're in the factory now, and
Yeah.
that's where we are.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I also found it difficult as a player
Yes.
taking that narrative control. I I mean, I am used to DMing or GMing, either one, but I as a player, I really
Mhm.
wasn't I didn't feel comfortable taking that for myself, and I found
Yes.
that like a really big adjustment period because I think I'm always trying not to step on the GM's toes as
Yep.
well. So it was a really hard thing to find that balance as a player to try and it's like, when can I take it? Am I
Yeah.
allowed to take it in this direction?
Yeah.
Like,
And I think,
yeah,
yeah, it's like how far can I go with this? What are the
yeah.
limits? And the answer is that there
Hmm.
aren't any. But the
Hmm.
problem is the GM might not know where you're going.
Right, right,
Um,
right.
so and I just think about a player who's not used to GMing and
Yeah.
how, like, if you are used to taking narrative control as a GM and it made you a bit uncomfortable to do this as a player, I think it could be really hard for a player who's never GM'd before to do this as well. So,
Totally.
in that case, like, you're going to have to play this based on what you're comfortable with and what your players are comfortable with. But if it seems like it's not going to be comfortable to give a lot of narrative control, then just do those kinds of things, like I was saying, like what happens with your attack. Like your attack is successful, it's this successful. Um, what happens? How do you do
Mm,
this much damage, basically? Um, yeah, and so speaking of that, another thing that I found a little bit hard is combat.
mm,
Because the rules are so light, it's a little bit hard for me. There's no like hit points or anything like that. So it was a bit tricky to figure out like what happens, when
mhm.
is the combat over, when is somebody like dead.
Down.
Like
Yeah.
yeah, it was a little bit tricky.
Mhm.
So that's just something that I think after our first session, I was sort of like, I don't know how I feel about this. Like,
Yes.
I was like, it's feeling weird, right?
Yeah.
But once I got used to it a little bit more and thought about it a little bit more, then I found the way to GM in this system that I was comfortable with, and I don't think I'm fully there yet. I think I would need some more practice. But just because it takes practice doesn't mean that it's not a good system. I think I needed to practice DMing in other systems before I was really good at it as well. So, yeah.
Totally. For someone who wanted to take this on as maybe their first RPG or their first sort of GMing experience, what advice do you have, or what do you think would this be a good one to start with?
I think it could be a good first GMing experience but the thing that you need to know is there are no limits. Like you can do whatever you want, and if there's no like rule in the rule book that you're finding, just make it up. Do what makes
Right.
sense, and don't don't feel like you're doing the wrong thing. Like in my opinion, these rules light systems are meant to be flexible. So they haven't
Mhm.
specified a lot of stuff just because that's clunky and hard to learn and inflexible. But I think
Mhm.
if you're okay with being like, well, let's try it and see where it goes, then this will be fun and it'll be easy. Yeah, in that case.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
That made me curious too. I wonder if there are like pre-generated adventures for kids on bikes somewhere. Oh, you have one.
This is one that I got from Free Comic Book Day a couple years ago. It's called The House on Poplar Court. And I know that there's at least one more. I think it's called Kids in Space or something like that. So they
Oh,
do have them. And I did run that one previously. So the pre-generated scenarios I think might be useful for a quick little session, like at a convention or something like that. And also maybe a good way to get people familiar with the game and how it plays before creating their own character. However,
mhm.
I mean, I think that world building and character creation are the most interesting and fun parts of this game. And so I would recommend
Yeah.
just you don't need a pre-generated scenario.
So how this game, how Kids on Bike stacks up to D&D. So there are way less in the rules section.
Mhm.
Like comparing the player's handbook, I can't believe I don't have one within reach, but yeah, like this is such a small book, like dimension wise but also pages wise.
Yep.
And then D&D has like books, like multiple large textbooks about
Yes.
different rules and settings and options.
And there's so
So
many more details in your character, right?
yeah, yeah. So then coming from different games with so many rules and then coming down, paring down to this and still having it's still a really enjoyable but very different role playing experience. As
Yeah.
we mentioned earlier, the players have a lot more in the narrative control area,
Yeah.
whereas in Dungeons and Dragons, the DM, the dungeon master, has sort of final say on any given situation.
Mhm.
And that can get very railroady. Like there's the
Yeah.
danger of controlling too much.
Yep. This system is just overall much more flexible than Dungeons and
Mhm.
Dragons, and I want to say that, like, take that with a grain of salt, because you can do whatever you want in Dungeons and Dragons. You don't have to follow anything that's in the book, right?
Right.
So D&D can be flexible as long as you aren't too concerned about contradicting something that's in the book with what you're choosing
Yes.
to do. You're allowed to do that. It's your game, you're allowed
Right.
to do whatever you
Yeah.
want. I think that it
Yeah.
even says that in the book, but a lot of
Yeah, it
people
does.
don't play that way, right? Like, it's like,
Right.
well, this is the flanking rule that's optional and we're going to play with it, or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is how grapple works or whatever.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
but this system is much more flexible in that it doesn't even define a lot of that stuff. So
Right.
there's no contradicting the rule book. There's figuring out how you wanna approach it.
Mhm.
So that is neither good nor bad. That's
Right. It's
depending on
different.
who's playing. Yeah, it is
It's
different.
different. Yeah.
And obviously, the theme is very different from Kids on
Yes.
Bikes compared to D&D. So we're not in like a fantasy setting. You're just a normal Joe Schmo. Like,
Mhm. Mhm.
you're not special. Sometimes you're just a kid, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that is very different. It's similar to End of the World RPG, which we've also done a review on. Um, and that's just something to consider when you're thinking about what type of story you want to be talking about. Do you want elves and dwarves and magic, or do you want, like,
Kids getting their knees. Yeah.
nostalgia, retro stuff? Because that's really fun. It's one of the appeals of this game.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And one really minor thing, but I really liked, is that you get to use like a variety of your dice. Like I'm a dice hoarder. I don't know if any of you share that same affliction, but I'm
So
like
weird.
obsessed with my
No.
dice. So I'm like touching mine now. I'm like,
You're
oh
like,
yeah.
ah. Yeah, no,
But
I think that's definitely
getting
something to
to,
consider.
yeah. Yeah, like you're getting to roll that D12, even though you so rarely get to use it in Dungeons and Dragons. Like
Hmm.
there's reasons for using each one, and it's kind of like you're glad to have a full set instead of, oh well, all I needed was my D6, my D4, my D20.
Yeah. So, okay, overall verdict. Here's what I think. I'm a little bit hesitant about running this game. Sometimes it feels like things can drag, and I'm not sure what to do, and I feel like the players aren't sure what to do either. But
Mhm.
that, I think, is just an artifact of how this game is different from other games that we've all played, and I think you could get used to it, and you just need to, like, let go,
Mm,
and it'll be fine. I also think something that's really interesting is there's a lot of unique aspects of this game that we have purposefully, like, pillaged and applied to other role playing games that we're playing. So there's a lot of really great ideas um, in this book, like the collaborative character creation, like creating those connections between characters, collaborative world building. Also, I want to give a huge shout out to this book for being pretty explicitly inclusive. So the book starts out with a statement about how before you start playing, you should talk to all of your players and figure out if everybody's like what everybody's comfortable with content wise, because this is leaning on horror. Like it can be
Mhm.
scary, and so yeah, it specifically calls that out, and it also mentions to the GM like be aware of how your characters are respond or how your players are responding to what's happening in the game. Allow them to sort of uh, pause the game or rewind if something happens that they're uncomfortable with or any of that stuff. In addition, the book includes options for your character to have like a disability, or it includes a discussion of race, gender, and sexuality, and like how to portray that and incorporate that diversity into your characters, and how to play to those traits respectfully. So that's all laid out in the book, and I think that that's really, really great.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing that all uh, RPGs should consider including in their books, and
Hmm.
making sure that they have an inclusive playing space.
Hmm. So, what's your overall takeaway?
I really enjoyed this game. I agree that at some points we were kind of all of us as a group kind of fumbling with the mechanics of it,
Hmm.
but I think by the second session we'd all gotten a bit more comfortable
Yeah.
with it, and the story that you came up with from the world building was so fun to see
Hmm.
our ideas coming to life, and something that we all worked on together kind of coming to fruition. Like it felt
Manifesting. Yeah.
manifesting, and yeah, just kind of in like you we were getting to experience this thing that we all partook in, you
It
know?
really did feel collaborative, and I
Mhm.
like that. Like, in other RPGs, you have these character background details, and your character is very dynamic to you.
Mhm.
Um, but it often doesn't. I mean, a really good GM will endeavor to try and include little hooks and calls out to character backgrounds. Um, but this feels like a step above that, and you
Definitely.
feel super integrated into the story.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess for me, I would definitely want to play this again. This is a game that I would love to try again. I would love to try maybe even running myself someday, and trying that method we talked about earlier, where we just kind of maybe do a bit of a quicker world building and then jump right in the game and see what happens,
That would be I would love to see that, because you are not like, you do like to prepare a little bit more.
prep a lot.
Yeah. So
I'm
it
a
would
I'm a
it would
very prep
be
heavy,
it would be
a good
a
exercise for me.
departure. Yeah, it would be a
Mhm.
departure for you from what
Mhm.
your norm is. So that would be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, as a GM, I'm always trying to better my skills and grow in places that I'm weak. And I
Diversify.
think,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think that this would be a really big push in the improv area.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I would. My rating is 7 out of 7 polyhedral dice.
Okay. Mine is 6 out of 7, I think. But I love this. So,
Yeah, it was really fun. So yeah, well, thanks for joining us for this review of Kids on Bikes. Uh, we will link to our playthrough of the game and our world building below.
mhm. If you've
If
played the game and you have opinions, please include them down in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you guys think. Or if you have any specific responses or suggestions for how to go about GMing the game, we'd love to hear that too. So,
really new to the system, so
mhm.
feel free to offer us any prior experiences you have. Do you have any funny stories from when you were playing? We'd love to
Yeah.
hear them.
Yeah.
So comment down below, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing. And have a great day. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. I love rolling dice.